I'm Nicola Palmer, Marketing Manager at the Rural Planning Co. And today I'm asking Hannah Moule a few questions on the latest changes to Class Q permitted development. Class Q is an important area of planning for rural communities, allowing for the conversion of agricultural buildings to residential dwellings. If you want to know more detail about Class Q, please watch our webinar from July 2023 on Class Q scope and opportunities. This provides a brilliant insight into the do's and don'ts. So Hannah, first of all, please could you give us a brief overview? What is Class Q and what types of buildings are suitable?
So, Class Q refers to the part of the permitted development legislation. So going backwards a step, most types of development in the UK require express planning consent, where you have to actually go and ask the local authority for planning permission for something. But there is also something called the General Permitted Development Order, which sits in the town and country planning legislation. And the General Permitted Development Order has got lots of sections in it. And what that allows you to do, basically the government has already given permission for some of those types of development, for some of those projects. Yeah. So the Class Q relates very specifically, it's just the part of legislation which is Section Q, and that allows the conversion and associated building works to change the use of an agricultural building to residential. And what it means is that you're not actually asking for planning consent for that. The government has already said that subject to meeting certain criteria, you do have planning consent already. What you have to do is still something called a prior notification, which is a process where you're effectively notifying the local planning authority that you intend to exercise your Class Q rights. And so going through the prior notification process, there are lots of things that the council check, and we have to still provide even though it is permitted development, you still got to provide a pretty robust application that shows how you meet and evidence the Class Q criteria. So it still very much feels like a planning application, but it is sort of procedurally and technically slightly different to a full planning application. But yeah, the Class Q is just a bit of legislation. And in terms of what buildings are suitable, one of the criteria of the Class Q legislation is that we have to be able to show that the sort of spirit and the aim of Class Q is that these buildings are being converted. So what they don't want is extensive amount of rebuild and where you're effectively just building a new build from scratch. They want this to be a conversion of the original agricultural building. So in order to demonstrate that it's convertible, only certain types of buildings are convertible anyway because of their construction and the condition of their construction. But B, we have to, through the prior notification process, it's sensible to show and evidence how you're going to actually physically and sort of in a building way do that conversion. So we put together something called a conversion method statement, which is where we show literally piece by piece in the building how we're going to convert that from an agricultural building to residential. Okay. So what it means, because we're converting a building, only certain types of buildings are convertible. And in brief, this isn't totally exhaustive, but generally speaking, anything that is sort of brick and stone is normally relatively well built and has longevity in its construction. We can also do Class Q on steel frame buildings, so steel frame, breeze block. We can do it on concrete buildings quite often as well, so concrete frame, concrete panels, concrete walls. What we struggle to do Class Qs on are pole barns, where you've got telegraph poles and with tin around it, where the posts and the steel, the main frame is timber, because quite often where they've gone into the ground, they've rotten at the ground level, or perhaps they've had animal muck around them and that erodes it and rots it. So really, you've got to look at the main frame of the building and see if it's truly convertible. Can you keep what is already there without extensive rebuilding? Yeah. And you've sort of got to look at each element of it to see if it's suitable. So we look at the frame itself, we look at the walls, and we look at the roof, and we look to see how much cladding there is around the building. Again, as a rule of thumb, you want the building to be 60-70% enclosed, really.
Okay.
I think 50 is not enough. It doesn't need to be 100% enclosed, but I think from experience, if you've got 3 walls that are enclosed, that's normally okay.
And in the building then, does that utilise that cladding? Do you need to utilise that in the building plans?
Yes.
Okay.
Certainly on paper, as far as the Class Q goes, we do.
Right.
So quite often what we do is I know we're going to come on to this in a bit, we use Class Q as a sort of stepping stone for potentially going and making other design changes, or maybe even knocking down the original building and starting again. But as far as the Class Q goes, we have got to be able to demonstrate that we are utilising the existing building and the materials that are there. So the legislation does allow for some new materials to go in. What you don't want is really new structural elements. You don't really want any new structural elements, but it does allow for the installation or replacement of roofs and walls. But what you don't want is to be replacing all of the roof and all of the walls, because then the building operations would go beyond what's considered reasonably necessary. You know, then it's no longer a conversion. If you're taking off all the walls and taking off the roof, you're left with a frame, and then it's not a conversion, it's a rebuild. So what we look at is if it needs a new roof, but the walls are brilliant, that's probably okay. If the roof is okay, but a couple of the walls need replacing, that's probably okay. So you have to take a judgment as to in the total amount of works that are needed on this building, where the line of what constitutes reasonably necessary is. And so, yes, what we want to be doing is utilising and retaining the existing materials.
Could you just something you talked about then, was it the Class Q building schedule that you said we do as part of the application?
We call it a conversion method statement.
Right.
So,
what's that then?
So what we do when we do a Class Q application, we do a planning statement document which covers the criteria. You have to, there's all these criteria, and we can talk about those. You have to make sure that you cover all those criteria. But one of the criteria is that the building must be capable of conversion. It's structurally sound and capable of conversion, and doesn't constitute a rebuild. And so, and I would guess, I don't know the stats for this, but I would guess 70% of Class Qs are refused on that point alone. It's rarely the other criteria. The vast majority all relates to the construction and the quality of build and the structural soundness of the original building. So what we do, and have done now for a couple of years, and I think has contributed greatly to the success that we see in Class Qs, is we spend quite a lot more time and we do a conversion method statement. And what we do is we bring in the structural survey. So we make sure that we can demonstrate that the building is structurally sound, you know, that it's not about to fall over, structurally sound. And then we look at what actual building operations have to happen to the walls, to the roof, to the floor, to the frame, to the windows and doors. And we expressly go through each of those elements and we talk it through in the document. And then we sort of make a conclusion of, yes, this is a building operation, but it's expressly set out and permitted by Class Q. Or actually this doesn't, you know, a lot of the internal stuff doesn't even constitute development, so that doesn't even come into the Class Q. The thing that you have to remember is that a Class Q application, like other planning applications, are being reviewed and assessed by a planning officer, and a planning officer is trained in planning, not building or architecture or development or building control or surveying or anything else. And so they, with all due respect to planning officers, in a lot of instances don't or wouldn't have a big understanding of like construction techniques and everything else. So for us to actually walk them through that,
you're providing them with the information,
and then it's easy. They don't have to question it, or they don't have to sort of think about, you know, is it convertible? They're not trying to make the decision. We're walking them through to show and clearly evidence that it's convertible. And look, there's no building operations. and then it's all there in front of them.
And probably worth noting at that point that we have Nadia as our architectural
technician.
Yeah, so she's really useful in helping with that.
It just means that by using our own in-house designer, Nadia is very experienced in class Qs.
Yeah.
We do a lot as a firm, and it just means that between the planning consultant and Nadia, we can really we know what we've got to keep, what element we can lose or change or modify. And you see, Nadia is also thinking about it from an end building perspective, because she does our building regulations drawings, so she's already thinking about what needs to stay, what needs to change, what in practical terms can actually be converted, and how the building would work. So that they all go hand in hand, and it's part of the process.
Brilliant.